Most people think that if you can get a mortgage and the monthly payment is less than the amount that you would have paid in rent, then it's better to buy, and that ultimately renting is just throwing money out of the window. Well, the reality is much more complex, and there are actually lots of hidden costs that come with home ownership. And because of this, there are often times when renting, at least from a financial perspective, is actually the better option. And what we're going to be looking at today is whether now is one of those times. House prices are stretched. So stretched that the average cost of a home is over 8 times average annual earnings. That's higher than it has been for over 100 years. Part of this is due to house prices rising, but it's also due to wage growth stagnating. But what's also interesting is that rents have also stagnated. Rents as a proportion of our take-home income has stayed more or less the same for the last 10 years. And instead, the pandemic has actually caused rents to go down in a lot of places. So we're in this interesting scenario where renting may actually be more effective than buying. And the press have been picking up on this a lot recently. But how do you work out if this is true in your area? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how. Hello and welcome back to the channel. For anyone that's new here, hi, my name is James, and this is a place where you can learn everything that you need to know to make better financial decisions. So first up, I want to clearly set out the aims for this video. I want to give you a high-level formula that you can use to gauge whether it makes sense to rent or buy in your area. Now, this formula will not be 100% accurate. That is not the idea here, but it should be accurate enough to be used as a guide. And if you are looking at a property that you're looking to rent or buy, and you gauge that it meets the criteria of this formula, then you know that it's time to go in and do some digging and do a proper calculation. But to create this formula, we're going to have to go through all the costs and considerations that you're going to need to take into account. So by the end of this video, not only are you going to have a really good guide to judge whether renting or buying is best, but you're also going to know all of the steps that you need to go through to actually do the proper calculation and work out which is best for you. The data we're going to be using in this video is from the UK, but you can use these same principles to answer this question wherever you live. Now, when it comes to renting, it's really easy to see what our costs are. It's simply our rent, and we pay that every month, and that's it. It's gone. There is no residual value that's left over at the end of the month. But when it comes to owning a home, there are also unrecoverable costs. So things that you have to spend money on that do not add value to the home, or they are just maintaining it to the same level. So what we're trying to identify in this video is how much it really costs each year to own a home as a percentage of the value of the property, so that we can then compare this with the cost of renting or the rental yield to work out which is better. So there's 4 categories of costs that we're going to be looking at. The first is one-off costs. So these are big fees, taxes, and expenses that you have to pay as part of owning a home. The second is maintenance, which is pretty self-explanatory. The third is the cost of debt, so interest payments. And the fourth is cost of capital. And this is the part that people don't often think about. So let's start with the odd one out, one-off costs. Now, clearly, unlike all the other costs we're going to look at, these are not recurring. These only happen once, but they're so big that we can't really ignore them. But of course, trying to change this into an annual figure is going to greatly depend on how long you actually own the home for. So yesterday I sat down with my colleague Ben, who is a mortgage broker, to try and estimate some of these costs. And the costs that we were looking at were stamp duty, mortgage application fees, valuation fees, solicitors fees, and of course, we can't really ignore this, but estate agent fees when you finally sell the property. Now, this will of course vary from region to region and on the value of your home and on whether you're a first-time buyer or not. But all we're really trying to do here is make some informed assumptions so we can get to our high level figure. And the figure that we arrived at is 1% of the value of the home each year. Now, this may seem pretty high, but you've got to remember that most people that are asking this question are first-time buyers, and first-time buyers typically tend to spend less time in their first home. So proportionately, these one-off costs can seem much bigger. Next, we have maintenance costs. Now, again, the data on this is fairly limited, but I found some recent research conducted by a property management company called Housey, and they found that their landlords typically spend 28% of their annual income each year on maintenance. And given that the average rental yield in the UK is 3.54%, this would equate to just under 1% a year of the value of the home spent in maintenance costs. Now, I think it's also fairly safe to assume that a similar thing would apply to owner-occupied properties. So there we have another 1% of the value of the home in unrecoverable costs as a result of maintenance. But now we get on to the interesting parts, starting with the cost of debt. Now, unless you've won the lottery or you're an Instagram Forex trader, there's a very high chance that you're going to need a mortgage when you buy property. And according to data from Money Supermarket, the average first-time buyer starts with an 18% deposit and an 82% loan. So how much will this cost us in interest? Well, here you're looking at data from the Bank of England that shows how rates on a 75% LTV, so that's loan to value mortgage fixed for 2 years, have come down since 2010. And we can see that on average over the last 5 years, you could get a rate of about 1.75%. However, I want to make sure that this formula can be used in the future. And I don't think that that downward trend in interest rates is going to continue. If anything, they're going to rise. So to be on the safe side, we're going to round that up from 1.75% to 2%. So if we chose to fund the house purchase entirely through debt, the cost would be 2% per year. But what about the cost of capital? Now you're probably thinking, what the hell is cost of capital? But don't worry, you're about to find out. And it's actually very important. And it's something that most people forget to consider. If you're trying to work out whether it's best to rent or buy, then you've probably already saved up a deposit. And if you did choose to rent, then you could go and invest that deposit elsewhere. When you buy a home, you are investing in property. And yes, the vast majority of people do consider their homes an investment. But if you did choose to rent, you could invest that money in something else, something like the stock market. Now, if we expect the stock market to produce a higher return than property, then clearly our decision to invest in property is going to see us losing out each year. And this opportunity cost, or the cost of capital, has to be taken into account. So that begs the question, what returns can we expect from property and what can we expect from stocks? Well, I think everybody is well aware of the astronomical growth in house prices since the 1980s, sitting up over 1,000%. But that's not quite true, because first we need to consider how much of that growth was actually just down to inflation. And over that time, there was a lot of inflation. And what this data from Nationwide is showing us is that if you strip out the effects of inflation, house prices have only trended up at 2.5% a year. And that 2.5% growth, or 240% over the whole period, is known as our real return because it strips out inflation. Now, we could just use that 2.5% return in our formula, but any expected return shouldn't just be based on what has happened in the past. It should also consider what's likely to happen in the future. And it's quite clear to see that we're now looking at a very different environment as to what has happened in the past. And that is mainly due to one thing: interest rates. So we already know that since the 1980s, house prices have rocketed. And you can see that here by the blue line. But what you can also see is that rocket ship growth has only really started since interest rates have started to come down. And as you can see by the orange line, as interest rates have fallen further and further and further, house prices have gone up higher and higher and higher. And that's because house prices are extremely sensitive to interest rates. In fact, in 2019, the Bank of England produced a white paper that suggested that all of the house price growth between 1985 and 2018 can be accounted for by the decline in interest rates over that period. And they go on to state that their model predicts that if there is a sustained rise in interest rates and gilt yields of just 1%, this could result in a fall in real house prices of just under 20%. Now, as of the time of filming, it doesn't look like rates are going to fall. In fact, they are very likely to rise. So to err on the side of caution, we're going to reduce that real return of property from 2.5% to 2%. But what about stocks? Well, again, we can't just rely on past performance. We also need to take some consideration of the current market environments and the fact that valuations are really high right now. So what can we expect? Well, most big asset managers publish their forward-looking expected returns for different asset classes. And here you can see BlackRock's website. And you can see that over the next 5 years, their expectation is that from a UK perspective, international stocks will return 5.9%, whilst UK stocks will return 6.1%. Or let's just go with an average here and let's say 6%. Now, of course, we first need to strip out the effects of inflation from this. So let's assume that the UK hits its inflation target of 2%. So that would give us a real return from stocks of 4%. So if we expect to get a 2% return from property and a 4% return from stocks, then clearly by choosing to invest in property, we can expect to miss out on 2% of return that we would have otherwise got if we had decided to rent and invest in stocks, which is why we would say our opportunity cost or our cost of capital is 2%. So handily, both the cost of debt and the cost of capital is 2%. So however we choose to finance the home, whether it's with 100% mortgage or 100% cash or 50-50, our costs are going to be the same. And because we also expect house prices to grow at 2% a year, this growth is eaten up by our costs of financing, which means that there is no benefit to leverage, which is normally one of the biggest benefits of investing in property. So I think we have it. If we want to buy a home, then our unrecoverable costs each year as a percentage of the value of the property are 1% in one-off costs, 1% in maintenance, and 2% in financing, whether that be finance from debt or capital, which would leave us with a total cost of 4% per year. So in theory, if you can find a property to rent that costs less than 4% of the value of the home each year, then you will be better off by renting. Of course, this is just a guide, but if you do find a property that comes anywhere near these criteria, then you know that the next step is to go away and do your own precise calculation using all the factors that we've considered today. You also need to consider all the other subjective pros and cons that come with renting, like the flexibility that you get from renting versus the security that you get from home ownership and being able to do whatever you want with the property. But I hope you can now see that renting is by no means throwing away money.